Today we explore the implications of these sanctions with two experts, Hassan Al-Khatib, a political science professor joining us from Kentucky, and Majid Boudin, an international law professor. Thank you both for joining us. Let's start off with Professor Al-Khatib. How do you interpret the Trump administration's decision to sanction the ICC judges at this particular moment?
It's not surprising. I mean, this is expected, but it's important to note that international law, international organizations, most of the time, they're not controversial. Many people focus on the Security Council, the American veto or the Russian veto, but most of the time, the work of the UN is non-controversial and goes without issues. You have the World Food Program, the World Health Organization. You have all kinds of organizations that function with no problem. They help all people of the planet. They do a good job, actually. But so the exception is the problem. Even with international law, there is law that governs, for example, sending a letter across national borders. There is the aviation treaties. There's an agency, the International, I think, Aviation Agency. So you have all kinds of agency, all kinds of law, international, that's fine, and there's no problem with it. It's only when you have issues with high political valence that you'll have the controversy and you have the issue of sovereignty and the issue of power comes into calculation. And what we see as to ICC is the issue of power and the fact that the US dominates the international system.
Okay, Professor Boudin, if we could get your opinion here as well. Given that the US is not a party of the Rome Statute, what legal grounds does Washington claim for these sanctions, and what does this mean for international law in general? Sir, Professor Boudin, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hi. Given that the US is not a party of the Rome Statute, what are the legal grounds for Washington to claim, sanctions over the ICC, or at least ICC judges, and what does this mean for the application of international law?
Well, first of all, as far as the US are not part of the ICC, or the country, the US is not part of the ICC, of the International Court of Justice, they have no reasons to feel that they are attacked. It's very simple. They are not part of it. The ICC did not go after the US here. They went against Netanyahu and Gallant. They went under an international instrument, which is ratified by countries part of the UN. So there is no person who is putting in question the legality of an international convention, an international treaty. The Rome Convention is a treaty. And states are free to make treaties, and there is no need for a country to be part of a treaty. It's not compulsory. It's the will of this country who is prevailing. So there is no problem. Why the US now is doing that, and on which ground? And there is no ground, frankly speaking. There's no ground for the US to issue these threats. If some countries will go now before a US court and challenge this decision to certain other judges in the ICC, it's more probable than not that they will win, that a US court will declare that these decrees, these decisions are not legal. They're not legal under the US law, because there is no harm to the US security. There is no prejudice to the US, to the US as a country, as entities, as people, as there is no reason. Now, under international law, they have no ground. This is a political decision made by the Trump administration for their own thinking, and the result, it's putting pressure on the judges. But here, this is not the first time. In the first Trump administration, we have seen this kind of decisions against the former prosecutor, the former judges, but they did not have any effect. There is no effect on that. Judges will not be threatened by that. And the fact that there is an interference, it shows that the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, is disturbing the impunity.
Okay, it seems that
this is a right for all the humanity to be respected.
Okay, Professor Al-Khatib, what about you? How do you interpret the European Union's support for the ICC in the face of these US sanctions? Do you agree there as well with Professor Boudin, that, you know, these sanctions are just a political move, not necessarily going to affect the course of action when it comes to international law?
The US is the leading power in the world. I mean, the Europeans, yes, they're trying to protect the court. They believe in it. And actually, the US believes in it, but it believes in it when it goes after people like Russia, people like go after less developed countries, and they go after them. So the US doesn't want to destroy the ICC, but they think that the US thinks that it should not be going after Israel, should not be going after the US, should be going after basically those that the US is in this agreement with. So it's politicizing the law. But again, this takes us to the debate in international relations between idealists and realists. By the end of the day, I mean, the reality is we don't have an international policeman. You don't have an international military. These are sovereign countries, and the law is written in a way which gives President Trump big leeway, a lot of leeway to interpret anything the way he wants, basically, until it's challenged. But then, even if it's challenged before judges, the judges will say this is foreign policy, and they will defer to the president as to foreign policy issues. So here, the institution, I don't think it's be damaged permanently by this, but it's just a way to punish these people who cross the line as far as the US is concerned. But this institution, and the whole of international law, the whole international institutions were invented by the West, actually. But they are used, unfortunately, they're used selectively to go after less developed countries, less powerful. And that's the reality of it, because the nature of the system is that
Which kind of begs the next question here, Professor. I mean, as you said, this is just a selective way of doing international law. How can the international community ensure that, you know, international law is applied? Like you said, the US is a superpower, and they get to choose who has the application of international law on. Otherwise, they're going to face sanctions or not have any form of, retribution. Like, for instance, the ICC arrest warrants against the Prime Minister of Israel. He's been able to travel with relative impunity anywhere he wants, and no one's arrested him.
Yes. That's the reality of the world. We don't have a global government. We don't have a world government. We have the United Nations. The nations of the world are members of this organization. But there is the high body, the UN Security Council, where the powers, they have veto power. They can stop everything. So if you are violating international law, but you have a friend with a veto power, then you get away with things. That's how it is. Unfortunately, this is how it is. And it's not going to change, because the powerful are not going to give away their power. And but most of the time, but it's important to remember, international law is not all high political value, high political valence. Many times, it's mundane issues, disputes between countries about rivers, boundaries, and these are solved usually without big problems. But when you have the United States and you have Israel with a lobby in the US, with a powerful lobby, then it becomes a different matter. But most of the time, I think international law, the United Nations organizations, they do their work. It's fine, it benefits everyone. It's only a few cases, it's a tiny percentage, I think, of international law and UN work that's controversial. And it reminds us of the nature of the world, which is the powerful states, small states, and big states, powerful states get away with things that small states can never get away with. Iraq and invading Kuwait, the Israelis occupying the West Bank and Gaza, violating all kinds of resolutions. That is the double standard, and but it's the reality that the double standard is a fact of life.
So, Professor Boudin, do you agree here? I mean, what kind of broader implications for the international law do we see when a major power like the US takes these stances, these confrontational stances, does this prove that international law has a lot of holes in it, and that the powerful basically rule, and there may necessarily be a breakdown when it comes to the international law, especially if it has to do with the powerful?
Well, there is, in international law, there is only one standard. And this is the ground of international law. This is the foundation. These are the bases of international law. There is no double standard. There is one standard. And this standard is applicable for everybody. Where is the problem? The problem is that some countries, they wanted to extract themselves or their allies from the application of international law. And by doing that, this is a breach of international law by itself. Now, this is the law as it is. But in practical terms, this can happen. But if this can happen now, and this can be a victory now for Netanyahu to travel to Hungary or to other countries, and he's not arrested, and international law is not made applicable against him, it doesn't mean this will remain forever. So the major point is not to abandon international law. These standards, these principles are the only protection that the weak...
But by design, sir, don't you agree that by design, that the way these international bodies have been created is to serve the powerful, as some countries have veto power, for instance, while others don't, and therefore are facing relative impunity when it comes to the application of an international law or sanctions or whatever it is?
They don't have, nobody has a veto on the International Court of Justice.
Not in the ICC, but for instance in the UN Security Council, we've seen time and again the US veto resolutions, for instance.
True, but this, we have to tackle it in a different way. Before the ICC, there is no veto. Before the International Criminal Court, there is no veto. So the problem is whether who can make these decisions applicable or not. The second point is to go to the to the UN Security Council, and here the five permanent members: the US, England, France, and China and Russia. They have a veto, but they have a veto for resolutions. They don't have a veto against the decision of the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. So here, until now, we have never seen a decision or a veto made before these high-level judicial body decisions. So we have to continue and try to do that. But here we have to find the way how to do it in a very appropriate way, so we can not have a reaction with a veto. And until now, the US cannot imagine even themselves making a veto against an International Court of Justice. It's not possible, because they will ruin their own system.
Yes.
And they will ruin the rule of law. And once again, if a state or a group of people or a person will go before a US court, they have very big chances to overturn or block these decisions against an international judicial body. And we have seen that there are a lot of decisions from the judiciary in the US. They have blocked decrees from President Trump or from other presidents. So the US is a country which is governed by the rule of law. So we have to go before the judiciary system, and the rights will be upheld.
Okay, Professor Khatib, now the US argues that these sanctions are there to protect the sovereignty of the US and that of its allies. Is this a valid justification in the context of international justice? And if this is a valid argument, does this not apply to every single country who decides to, for instance, sanction an ICC judge?
I agree with your guest that the law doesn't have a double standard. The law is the law. But see, the key is the way the US sees the violation of the law. So, for example, Iraq invading Kuwait, that's a blatant violation of international law. That's immoral, illegal. That's a clear violation of the UN Charter. You should not do that. You don't invade your neighbor and say you don't want to annex them. The same thing with Israel and the Palestinians. They have occupied the West Bank and Gaza is occupied territory. They're building settlements. They're violating all kinds of international law. The problem is double standard, the political double standard. There's no legal standard. So that's one issue. The other issue is, yes, you can take a decision, but they say the key is not getting a decision from the judge. The key is executing on the decision. If you can't execute on the decision, then what's the point of getting it? It's a moral victory if you get a decision and you can't enforce it. That's the issue, the politics of enforcing these decisions. There is no hope to get help from the US judiciary because by American conventions, the president is allowed to violate international treaties, actually. They will say, well, the US government wants to violate the treaty, go sue somewhere. But the problem is that when it comes to foreign policy, these judges are very reluctant to get involved. They say it's a political question. This is the president of the U.S. This is foreign policy. You know, they will defer to the political branches, the Congress, the president, and they really try to avoid. They're not going to tell the president you take the side of the ICC against the president. They're not going to do that. And anyway, the president is going after individuals, not the institution itself. He's going after judges, individuals, travel ban, all that. And that's foreign policy. That's conducting foreign policy. This is the part of the president. He's saying these people can't enter the U.S. The judiciary is going to say, not going to say, no, these people have the right to enter the U.S. Nobody, non-immigrant, has no right to enter the U.S. Therefore, I'm not optimistic as to the American judiciary putting a break as to the Trump administration, as to foreign policy and international law. But as to domestic politics, then it's a different ballgame. They will say it's unconstitutional. You'll have all kinds of pushback. But as to international law, international organizations, then the president has a lot of leeway.
So you agree that the president has the right or has the legal justification to sanction, even if you disagree with the idea of sanctions itself?
Yes, because the law is written broadly as to national interest. The way it's written gives a lot of leeway to the president to interpret the law. Therefore, yes, I think he's on solid legal ground going after certain individuals, yes.
Okay, Professor Boudin, how do you assess the impact of these sanctions on the ICC's ability to function as an independent judicial body? Obviously, not allowing them to enter into the US is one thing, but freezing their assets is a whole other ballgame there. Do you think this is going to make them less independent?
No, if I don't believe these kind of judges, they have high morality. They have high personal skills. They will not be threatened by that. So the fact that they are now subject to these threats and to these decisions, which are harming to them, it doesn't make them change their position. But there is a possibility for the judges, for any other person who is interested in seeing law enforced and law made applicable, to go to other venues and to obtain the lifting of these sanctions. Why? Because even if the president of the U.S. had the power to forbid to any person to enter the country, and any executive for any country, they have a sovereign possibility.
Okay, it seems that we have a transmission issue there. But I'd like to thank both my guests. Thank you, Professor Khatib and Professor Boudin, for your insights and your analysis. Thank you for joining us. And as the Trump administration's sanctions present a critical test for the ICC's independence and the future of international justice, this brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ham Morsi. Stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.